This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
You know, folks sometimes wonder how to think about social media, how to translate it. And one of the ways I describe social media is that something that has always been present within African American life. When you think about how black users, for instance, use Twitter, and some of the research has suggested that more than a quarter of the population of the folks who use Twitter happen to be African Americans. Of course, that's twice their population here, the percentage of their population here in the United States. And one of the things that researchers have found that black folks tend to use Twitter as if it was an instant messenger. And I always use that to talk about it in the context of something that we call fictive kin. That moment where you see African American folks, black folks who are walking around and they come into contact with another black person that they don't know and instinctively will give a head nod to say what's up and move on, right? And it's this idea that I don't know you, but because we're black folks, we're fictive kin. We're related in some way, so I want to acknowledge you. And so black folks tend to use Twitter in that same sort of context. And in many ways, it's no different than ways that we've used and created forms of social media historically. So that when you think about workers in the field, whether this is during the slavery time or afterwards, and we have folks who are singing these work songs and what have you, that functioned as a form of social media. They weren't just singing songs to pass the time, but in many ways attempting to communicate different kinds of messages with each other that they couldn't just simply say to each other, particularly in terms of trying to keep the rhythm of the work. When you think about the early days of the social media, of the civil rights movement, you know, when social media of the day was in fact leaflets, you know, being produced on, you know, weren't even photocopy machines yet, right? This is first generation of being able to make copies. And they're handing out these leaflets. This was a form of social media. When you think about the Greensboro Four and them sitting down at their lunch counter and the way that these movements explode across the South in 1960, the language that we use to describe that today is that something goes viral. And in fact, what we see in the civil rights movement, the Greensboro movement in 1960, is black social activism going viral. So you see these kind of mechanisms of social media that have always existed in American life, that have always existed in black life, but you also see that black folks have often used it in ways that were at the cutting edge of activism and knowledge production and building community. By the emergence of the digital world, really the emergence of what we know as Web 2.0. Digital technology on the one hand, but in particularly new media and social media, things like Twitter and Facebook, email as an older version of that dynamic. When you think about where Black Studies was, for instance, 25 years ago, and if you were a black intellectual functioning in the academy and you wanted to reach a broader audience, with the exception of newspapers and with the exception of corporate media, it was very difficult for you to make that kind of connection. What we see now with this new digital platform, this new digital world, is the ability for black thought leaders to be in regular conversation with regular black folks, with the rank and file, who actually have the ability to be in contact with us in ways that are really unprecedented in thinking about the history of black intellectual thought. Many of our students are what we would describe as digital natives. The only thing they know is this digital world. The only world that they know is a world of cell phones and YouTube and all of these things. And for the most part, academia in general has lagged in terms of being connected in this way. This is part of what Craig Watkins is going to talk about in his keynote address. But we're really trying to catch up to them. And some of the things that we see in terms of regards of black audiences, more than 50% of black folks who consume digital content do so on mobile technology. You know, it's literally a mobile diaspora, if you will, in that kind of context. And at the same time, they're also using it in very cutting edge ways. We see this time and time again in research dealing with black folks on Twitter and black folks on Facebook. And so the black intelligentsia really is struggling to catch up with their audience in this regard. As Craig Watkins, who of course is the keynote address for this conference, we're old friends from the University of Texas. at Austin when I was there a few years ago, and Craig has done cutting edge work in hip hop culture, particularly hip hop and film. And he's begun to make this transition to do work around young people and their use of digital technology. His groundbreaking book, The Young and the Digital, of course, is a great example of that kind of work. And what Craig is really interested in is how do we function in a world that is connected? We are connected all the time in so many different ways, so much so that we use language like being off the grid. If we have to be on a beach for a day and a half or something along those lines. And Craig is really considering for this conference what the consideration is in the context of being connected for Black studies. What are the implications of Black studies being disconnected from this world, and what are the empowering possibilities of Black studies connecting to this world, both in terms of us being able to collaborate as scholars across a wide array of activities and also places and spaces, but also being connected to everyday folks, right? To be able to more directly impact upon the everyday lives of Black folks via social media and digital technology. I think if you were to ask W. Du Bois back in 1922, if you were to be able to transport him to 2012 and introduce him to Twitter, he would have inherently understood the value of it, right? Because it allowed him to reach an audience beyond those folks who would have been reading the Crisis magazine, to reach an audience beyond those folks who would years later read his great book, Black Reconstruction. And so part of the things that we wanted to do with the conference is that, if the university represents this kind of space for the creation and dissemination of knowledge, how can we take that information and knowledge and present it beyond the four walls of the university, of the classroom, if you will? And so one of the things we thought was fundamentally important to this conference, Black Thought 2.0, was the idea that the conference would be live streamed. So those folks who would not have the ability to come to Duke, those folks who wouldn't even ever thought of coming to a conference at a university would be able to watch it online and get valuable information. We also wanted to be interactive. So students will be here live tweeting the conference, and we'll be taking questions from Twitter and other forms of social media so that, again, we can make that connection between what we see as black thought leaders and everyday Black folks who want to be able to weigh in the conversation and, in fact, have things to contribute to the conversation that maybe we may be blinded by because of our position in the academy.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.